Hey everyone, it's Beverly Hallberg. Welcome to a special pop-up episode of She Thinks, your favorite podcast from the Independent Women's Forum, where we talk with women and sometimes men about the policy issues that impact you and the people you care about most. Enjoy.
Welcome to She Thinks. I'm Inez Stepman with the Independent Women's Forum, and I'm pleased to have with me today Daniel Schwarmenthal, who's the director of the American Jewish Committee's Transatlantic Institute in Brussels. And before taking on that role, he was an editorial page writer and editor at the Wall Street Journal, which is where he recently published a piece that we're going to talk about today titled To America, From a Worried European Friend. Welcome, Daniel. I'm so glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Inez. Glad to be on your show.
So you open up your op-ed, which I highly recommend that all of our readers go and find and read with these sentences. History and evolutionary biology teach us that the normal course of human affairs is tribalism, oppression, and poverty. The emergence of liberal democracies isn't the inevitable endpoint of supposedly linear Western progress, but an aberration, and a rather fragile one at that. So isn't this exactly what this particular strain of sort of left-wing ideology going all the way back to perhaps Hegel or popularized by Marx and the sort of wheel of history turning? And then in terms of more contemporary politics, right? President Obama famously warned people to be, quote, on the right side of history, right? This idea that history is progressing to an endpoint and we're going to become endlessly more prosperous, endlessly freer, endlessly, sort of progressing to a higher plane of equality every time the wheel turns. This seems to be very deeply embedded strain of thought, especially on the left, but even to some extent on the right in America. Reagan, by contrast, despite being generally optimistic, emphasized, I think, the opposite, what you do here, right? The fragility of freedom, the possibility of returning to 1,000 years of darkness, to the Dark Ages. Can you explain why that underlying difference, perhaps in perspective with regard to the progress of history and the fragility of where we are now, why does that have important political consequences in your view?
Right. I think the way I see it, I think the misconception that liberal democracy is the inevitable outcome of our civilization. I see it as common on the left as on the right, and I think it has a lot to do. Certainly, maybe here I'm speaking more from a European perspective. That Europe hasn't seen a war on its own territory now, luckily for over 70 years, and in that sense, the United States. I would just since the 1812 war with Britain hasn't seen anyone's territory. So it's sort of also after the Cold War, this sort of belief now democracy has ultimately won the contest over ideology or over what is the right form of government, and so I see this. Quite widespread among society. This belief that democracy is firmly embedded, and I unfortunately, if we look at history and if we also turn as I referenced it in this piece to evolutionary biologists, it's not the case. It took us some 2,000 years to get where we arrived, and many of our natural instincts is to distrust the other, and therefore we have to be very, very careful and make sure that we preserve these liberal democracies that we have, and of course at the same time we of course ought to strive to protect them, right? But we need to be very, very careful that these ideas survive.
So I want to then ask you, actually, since you do see democracy as fragile, and I agree with you. I think now we're seeing, perhaps you closed your piece with sort of an ominous ominous tone, right? That you're more worried about the continued survival of liberal democracy, both in the U.S. and correspondingly around the world, than you used to be. Do you see, for example, the American founding as fundamentally a different creature? When you talk about how we have instincts towards tribalism, right? Most European countries, to completely simplify, hundreds and hundreds of years of history, most European countries were more or less started on the basis of a tribe, right? There was sort of a smaller tribe and larger tribes, bound together. Eventually, you have sort of a unification and a modern nation state out of that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't multiple peoples within national borders, and it certainly doesn't mean that immigration doesn't change the composition of who lives within those borders. But unlike most European countries, right, America has a founding date now questioned by the 1619 Project, right? But July 4th, 1776, and a founding sort of creed and document. I think that's probably why we've been able to have such a diverse people, right? Truly from the beginning, America has never had really a tribe. And now we talk about, especially the left likes to talk about quote unquote whiteness, but that's certainly not how people saw the different European peoples who were in the United States at the time. I guess what I wanted to ask you about this is our diversity, which I argue and I believe still has been an incredible strength for the United States when it has had this edifice that did bind us together as a people, this creed, and then a certain amount of both historically justified and also sort of mythologized founding characters. If we lose that, does diversity quickly become a weakness for the United States in the sense that we perhaps don't have the same kind of long-term kinship or cultural ties as many European countries? Is there something about the United States that desperately, especially needs that e pluribus unum? I guess is what I'm asking you.
Yeah. No, it definitely, I see diversity as a great strength for any society. But it does, again, if you look at human nature, if you read what evolutionary biologists have to say, it does make the creation of what sociologists refer to as social cohesion, the sort of the sticky stuff that holds society together, that extends the traditional tribal loyalty to people beyond your tribe, to people who do not look like you, who have maybe different religion. It makes it more difficult to create this, and that is indeed the miracle of the United States, the oldest democracy, that it has managed to do just that. And it is indeed based on the shared principles of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, that has enabled America to create this incredibly diverse and successful and prosperous society. And indeed, I fear that if one challenges or undermines these creeds that indeed make it possible that Americans and new immigrants from one day to the other basically can become American and are in principle recognized by other Americans as fellow citizens, that is only possible as long as Americans agree on these principles. And if they're now being taught that those principles are false, they never really existed, that America not only failed to live up to these ideals, but that these ideals were pretty much a lie, then I'm very worried what this would do to social cohesion, to the ability of American society to continue to function. And as I lay out in this piece, I'm worried that this would be a contributing factor to social strife with no end in sight.
You make a related claim about the American system in your piece. I think we're kind of circling around it. So let's get to the heart of it. You make a claim that the American system is just. Not that it's perfect, not that it cannot be, not that the project of American citizenship isn't to make a more perfect union. but that it is fundamentally just, right? So that there are now many in the United States who deny that we have a just system, and they point to what they call, quote, systemic racism, right? So nobody denies, and you acknowledged explicitly in your piece that instances of racism exist, of course, in the United States and around the world. But there is a very important difference between acknowledging that individual instances of racism exist and impact people's lives, and then indicting the system itself with that charge. And then, of course, in America, and I'm sure abroad, we don't even agree on what our definition of racism actually is. So Ibram Kendi, for example, whose book on anti-racism is now recommended by virtually every Fortune 500 company in America, he posits that disparities themselves between ethnic groups or racial groups are themselves proof positive of discrimination. And that's a definition obviously not accepted by large parts of the American people. So what lies ahead? I think we've talked a little bit about what lies ahead for America in terms of potential disunion among our many squabbling parts of our 350 very different people, 350 million, that is. But what I think you're right, because your piece is from the perspective of, quote, a European friend, right? What are the consequences for the world and for geopolitics if America loses faith in the justice of its own system and deems itself, as you say, unfit to lead? What are the consequences for people around the world?
Right. So I wrote this from a very personal perspective also. As I describe in this piece, I was literally raised by my parents to acknowledge and to always be aware of that, had it not been what Madeleine Albright called the indefensible nation, all of Europe's Jews would have been exterminated, including my own parents, and which means that I would have never been born. So for me, American exceptionalism is existential. And I also had the privilege, no pun intended, to actually then study and live in the United States and make a lot of personal friends to this day, and also it enriched me intellectually. America's traditional concept of freedom of speech, for instance, is something that is very, very different from the European or continental European tradition. And so that's one part of sort of a very personal journey for me, and my personal concerns for a country that I deeply appreciate. But as a citizen of Europe, of the Western world, I am worried, and I think everybody ought to be worried, that if indeed America convinces itself that it is inherently and irredeemably racist, it would mean that it would obviously, inevitably, no longer consider itself to be fit in any way to lead the free world, as we now say. And I don't mean this in the sense that the United States ought to be intervening militarily around the world. It's the very existence of America as the leader of the free Western world, and its posture and its self-confidence as such, that provides the basic architecture of security and stability in Europe, in many other parts of the world. And if America as a society were to lose its self-confidence and were to give up this role, we know who will fill this vacuum. It's not the good guys. It's not liberal democracy. It's Russia, it's China, it's Iran, players like these. So I see this not only as a tremendous friend of America, as somebody who could have imagined actually becoming American myself. In many ways, I consider myself an honorary American. But really as so not only as I'm worried about it threat to American society and the survival of American democracy as such, but also obviously what the consequences, as I just described them, for the rest of the free world.
Yeah, I definitely see. I think we see that attitude of sort of stepping out of the leadership role. I mean, I see it increasingly in American discourse. Not just, I think, the more considered and sort of weary response to pull back perhaps from policing the world, which, as you rightly distinguish, sort of there's a difference between moral leadership in the world and soft power, and then using American blood and treasure to try to fix the world that isn't fixable. But there is this sort of self-flagellating response now in American politics to, especially when stories come in from abroad that are just, I mean, common sense. I mean, it frustrates me as well personally to see people make false equivalencies between, what's happening in the United States and what, for example, China does in terms of its human rights abuses to the Uyghurs and to other minority populations and to its own people. Or we've seen these incredibly brave democracy movements in Hong Kong and Belarus, and increasingly there is that response. Oh well, that's happening here, and it is a frustrating one, I think, for people who either have friends or family or experience themselves, some form of truly illiberal, dictatorship, to see those kinds of moral equivalencies made when there truly is no moral equivalency between anything that's happening in the United States and, for example, what Lukashenko does in his detention centers in Belarus to his own people. But are we seeing sort of a geopolitical divergence then between Europe and the United States? Because I'll tell you what sort of frustrates me, perhaps, as an American about our alliance with European countries. It's that oftentimes you see these polls, long-term polls done by Pew or by reputable polling firms, that show that, for example, there are a lot of people in Europe who believe that the United States is the biggest threat to world peace. There was a poll back a couple of years ago asking whether, what's the biggest threat to world peace? Is it, China, Russia, or the United States? And the U.S. is basically tied and a little bit ahead of China and then considerably ahead of Russia. At a time when in the United States, I think many are questioning some of those international commitments for reasons of weariness that we sort of distinguished before. These kinds of polls, I think, are very frustrating to Americans when, along the lines of, the things that Donald Trump often says about, European countries not making their commitments to NATO and then expecting the United States to carry that alliance. What is the future of sort of the alliance between Europe and the United States? How is it perhaps dependent? It seems like, to some extent, at least among friends of mine, it seems like a lot of Europeans do buy into some of the critical race theory that America is exporting to the world, and they have their own reasons for believing that U.S. leadership is not in their best interest. Do you see a parting of the ways, and would you see that as a catastrophe if there was to be a parting of the ways between European countries and the United States?
So these are all very important questions, and personally, and as an organization that is deeply committed to the transatlantic relationship, after all, the office here in Brussels is called the Transatlantic Institute for a reason. We take this very seriously, and we are, of course, also disheartened when we see some of the opinion polls that that look at America sometimes, or at certain parts of the population look at America more than opponent than as an ally. And there is a lot to do here among European leaders to correct this. At the same time, as you also mentioned, and this is something I was not able to get into my op-ed, the other reason why I'm a little bit worried about what I'm seeing in the United States is that America still is the leader of the free world, and that also means sort of the cultural leader in many ways. And we know that many ideas that start in the United States come over to Europe, as you rightly said, and we can see it particularly in the United Kingdom, which was always and is always closer to the US than continental Europe, and where some of these radical ideas have also already made quite an impact on universities and the media, and that's another worry for me, that it will also become stronger here in both in Britain and continental Europe, and therefore also serve to undermine the functioning of European society. So therefore, this is, in my view, many of these extreme ideas are, in my view, ultimately anti-Western. They are illiberal ideas, and therefore, by definition, will undermine our societies, and therefore also further undermine this relationship. Because if we are being taught that we are all inherently racist and so forth, that the West as such, or Western civilization as such, is largely a force for evil, then obviously the West as such will not, be able to work together, and that's very worrying.
I have a lot of the same concerns, so thank you for articulating them so well. I do have one more sort of debate or something to press you on to wrap this up here. So I think you rightly highlight in this column a rising of liberalism on the left, complete with attacks on the concept of free speech that you say, as you say, is so different in America from continental European law. I think actually a lot of Americans would be shocked at what can be banned, what kinds of speech can be banned in many European countries. But as you say, we have this tradition of extremely robust free speech that was once embraced by the mainstream of both sides, the political spectrum. Now that seems to be going on the left, and we have you mentioned 1984 as a manual, of course. I don't know if you've been following, but one of the more recent scandals in academia has been an actual defense of 2 + 2 = 5 on the basis that mathematics and objectivity are racist constructs. So they are indeed taking it as a manual there. But so you also have this paragraph, though, in here about rising of liberalism on the right, where we talk about sort of populism, and then in a more extreme form, of course, the far right and ties to fascism or Nazism. So it's not that I don't think that these folks exist. I know they do. They populate my Twitter mentions sometimes. But my question is, you seem to sort of make a balance here between the dangers of a liberalism on the left and on the right. Now, we know that the Harper's free speech letter, right, is essentially the last cry of the liberal left, which once marched through all of our institutions in the United States and now is being picked out by the illiberal left from those institutions. And that I see as the big difference here between, the Richard Spencers and sort of the alt-right. They may be dangerous in terms of being able sometimes to inspire individual acts of violence and tragedy, but they don't have institutional power in the United States, whereas the illiberal left, just took over the New York Times, right? It's held the Academy for decades, and we know that what the ideas generated in the Academy don't stay there. It's now, metastasized to our K-12 system, Hollywood, and the production of sort of all of our cultural products, which we talked about being so important in terms of American soft power in the world. Those are largely controlled now by the illiberal left. So I guess I want to push back against this equivalence a little bit, not because I don't think that, neo-Nazis exist and are dangerous in the United States, but because they don't hold any serious institutional power, which is why perhaps you'd like to defend that comparison. But I see it as an erroneous comparison because of just the levels of power that those sides hold.
Right. What I tried to lay out in my piece was the fear that I believe exists in America, out of these extremes, to see some sort of really civil strife and violent confrontations actually also on the street. And you are right, the far right has luckily no real institutional power, but they do exist, and we have seen anti-Semitic and racist violent terror attacks by the far right, and therefore not to mention it in the context of a piece that describes my concerns about illiberalism in general and potential of social undermining of social cohesion, social unrest would be incomplete if it didn't also mention the far right, which is often more violent, but as you said, is not dominating the social science and humanities department at university, which is what I also described, where these far left, and I really want to make sure that we're not talking, or I'm not talking about the left, but the far left really here has unfortunately has taken over a lot of control over educational material and the curriculum at universities, and is spreading illiberal ideas, and ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences, and all of this together, also with far right and also violent prone far right, is a very explosive cocktail in my view.
Well, we're undoubtedly living through a period of civil unrest. Let's hope that cocktail doesn't turn out to be a Molotov cocktail on the streets of America, but hopefully we can pull it together in the United States in time to take on some of the larger global liberal giants, like I think China is turning out to be. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. Please, again, make sure to read his Wall Street Journal piece, To America from a Worried European Friend. Once again, this is She Thinks. This is Inez Stepman from the Independent Women's Forum, and thank you so much for joining us on She Thinks today.
Thank you.